Retired, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know which.
Okay, the stream is starting. Let me make sure it's being picked up.
It's
Oh,
funny,
okay,
Go
we
ahead.
are live.
All right. Um, my name is Professor Robert Eisenman. I'm known somewhat for early Christian studies and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Particularly, I'm well known for the book James, the Brother of Jesus. I think I have a copy of it here, but I can't get my hand on it, so I'm not going to run. But it's out in Penguin, and I was really happy to get that out in the 90s. The point was, or is, I was teaching a course on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I realized that the establishment had totally misinterpreted the Dead Sea Scrolls. What they did is they went by Josephus's definition of the Essenes, and they had already automatically decided that these were, quote, so-called Essenes. Am I going too fast, or that's okay? These were
It's okay.
so-called Essenes. And what Josephus talks about in the normal Josephus is these peaceful, pacifist Essenes and so on and so forth. Well, that's fine if you don't read the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the point was, all these great scholars were not reading the Dead Sea Scrolls. They had just assumed what these were and didn't bother reading. But when you have in the scrolls a document that is contemplating the war against all peoples on the earth,
Right.
that is doesn't say love your enemies, but hate the sons of the pit, and is not full of love, but is full of aggressive militant messianism, which the scrolls are, then you have a total misconception of the writings you are dealing with. All you're talking about is some peaceful Essenes, out of which the books of early Christianity were developed. In other words, the gospel presentation, and I call it a presentation because it's more like a Greek storyline than it is history. And the problem is, people, it's more like literature. And what people don't understand is that literature is not history.
Right.
So they assume the gospel picture is history, when in fact it's just a Greco Roman history, just a Greco Roman literature. And what the scrolls are, they are the real thing. And the scrolls really upset these people. So they didn't want to deal with what the scrolls were. And that's the point. I started to deal with what the scrolls were. And
And
it was clear.
there's something radical about your thinking, though. You organized it very sensibly around political ideology as well, and that helped you once you cut through Josephus's whitewashing or politicized accounts of these groups. Once you cut through that description
And the Gospels, too.
and the Gospels, well, you though provided a key to understanding the Gospels and New Testament literature in that it has the opposite political orientation than say the Dead Sea Scrolls do.
Right.
And
Well,
if
yeah, go
right,
ahead.
and by cutting that fundamental line provided like X-ray vision. Now we can by that for me, I must say, in my own personal experience, as early as the 1980s, I was through just reading the New Testament, suspicious that it was taking a sort of a Roman side in the Jewish conflict,
Right.
Slightly,
just
slightly.
on the face of the gospel.
Render under Caesar what is
Right,
Caesar, and us what is
right. The
God.
centurion,
You
in
won't
fact, the
find
whole
this in the
craftsman
Dead Sea
narrative.
Scrolls. As
But
I said, that they say
Professor,
hate the sons of the pit.
right, Professor, I want to say on a personal note, I don't think I would have continued with that work had it not been for the publication of your work in the 90s. It inspired me and really got me thinking again that we really have powerful evidence once we start using the lenses you provided us that are both looking at it politically as well as religiously. And from that standpoint, the New Testament, it's almost obvious. It's a critical response to the more militant nationalist Torah Orthodox Jewish
It's a
rebels.
pacification of the. And now the next thing that develops is, why did the scrolls people end up on Masada And why do they all commit suicide rather than surrender? This is the behavior of extreme zealot groups, not Christian, I should say, collaborationist groups or Pharisee collaborationist groups. These are groups that are holding out to the last man and will not surrender, whatever happens, period. And so this is the behavior of the scroll people. But let me go back to what I was saying. The basic doctrine, when you read through the scroll literature, is righteousness. Righteousness. So you have a conception of righteousness, and then they start talking about the sons of righteousness or the B'nai Tzedek and so on and so forth. But then you find in early Christian literature, I found, having dealt with it very carefully, that the only historical material in this in the New Testament, as we call it, comes in the we document of Acts. The first 2/3 of Acts is in the style of the Gospels. It's more or less Greco-Roman literature, or I hate to use the word fiction because people don't like that word. So it's literature, it's literary, but it's not historical. The third part, the second part, the we document, suddenly gets historical. And that comes in around chapter 16, 17 or so, after the so-called
person in the
Jerusalem
way
conference.
it moves from the Acts moves from the describing things in the third person, and then strangely straight to the first person.
Absolutely.
We do that, and that's why it's called
the way through about chapter 16,
right.
after the so-called Jerusalem conference. And there, suddenly a person appears who's supposed to have been gone long ago, James. But we find that he's not James, the fourth apostle, or so on, who died. Even the people in Santiago de Compostela have it all wrong, because that James never got to Spain. So, all these,
Not even close, right.
to Santiago de Compostela, that's all mythology. But if you go back to the actual scripture, the James that really exists is this person we never heard much about, James, the brother of Jesus, or also called James the Tzaddik. Now, whoa, the righteous one, the just one, James the just, always called James the just. Why is he called James the just? This is a translation of James the righteous, or James the righteous one. And the righteous teacher in the Dead Sea Scrolls was always referred to as the righteous one. And in every interpretive document you have there, the word righteous one is always described in terms of the righteous teacher. So you begin to connect up the bolts here, and then you find out that this James in the second part, we document of Acts, actually doesn't survive, and he doesn't like Paul, and Paul doesn't like him.
Well, Galatians, there appears to be a heated argument between James and Cephas and Paul.
Right.
Galatians is it's said to be one of our earliest New Testament documents.
Fairly accurate. A lot of Galatians is fairly accurate, and the Paul material there is pretty revealing. Where it's quite clear that James is not someone, and the others who Paul likes. And we have things in the other letters: eat all the food in the butcher shops.
James is spying out Paul's freedom in Christ, as if Paul's new anti-Torah message has really upset James and the original community. They're spying out his freedom and trying to enforce Torah orthodoxy on him in his group, presumably.
Paul has a Roman citizenship. Basically, what Paul is, then you see that in the end, when he sends his regards at the end of Galatians and other letters, when he sends his regards, he's sending his regards to people in the Herodian family, who he calls finally his relatives, his cousins. So you realize Paul is an Herodian, descendant of the Herodian family. This is what clued me in. And I began to realize that this person was basically an agent of the establishment, or rather a spy, or if you want to call it that, on the movement. and they finally ejected him from the movement, and he has to go overseas where there's no pre-knowledge of these things, and starts all these communities in the Hellenistic Roman world. So we have a different community situation from what we have by the Dead Sea. So I'd rather stick to the Dead Sea. And there we have these documents are extremely messianic, to the extent that I call this the messianic movement in Palestine. My wife objects to the word Palestine, but the Romans were calling it Palestina, and Israel didn't exist anymore anyway at the time. So the messianic movement in Palestine, and they're very aggressive and very much, enamored of the messianic idea. And as I said, ultimately they give their lives for this, but it's not a messianic idea that you get in the Gospels. It's the very opposite.
So,
Could this? Okay, Jake, go ahead.
okay. So my next question is, I remember in your book, James, the brother of Jesus, you identify Paul the Apostle with Saul the Herodian that Josephus mentions. I think you also noted that Saul and Josephus appears after the death of James in a similar sequence to the way it works out in Acts, the Saul and Stephen thing. Stephen got stoned, and you identify Stephen with James. Could you discuss that?
Well, those are some of the things that I've, lost over time in my mind. And people will have to go to the documents you were speaking about to get the full picture. So I really can't elaborate on that any more verbally, except to say that, the Stephen stoning is really the stoning of James, because that's the only stoning we hear about in Josephus at this time. And I also think that we do have some pretty accurate information from the church fathers, Hegesippus, fairly close to the first century, and so on, that James was thrown off the bulwark of the temple and ended up in, the valley down below, and basically died in that manner. So he was treated like a very threatening heretical person by the establishment, by the Herodian Pharisee establishment. Paul is never treated like that. Paul is greeted. He's let go. He gets away to Caesarea. He takes a boat to Rome. In Rome, no one bothers about him, etc., 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 etc.
Well, Acts
So he's not really a very threatening person. Then the Christianity that he unleashes on the world, people get a lot of inspiration from it. Fine, but they don't realize it is chock-a-block full of anti-Semitism, because Paul is anti-Semitic. And if we want to know where the Holocaust comes from, unfortunately, it comes right out of the Gospels. And it's sad, because Christians are of a loving nature, but they were undermined like this from the very beginning by this Pauline ethos. And Paul is a very aggressive person. Look in his letters. I mean, he really is aggressive. There's no brotherly love in Paul in his letters. People have to read his letters to see some unpleasant, aggressive attitudes.
My next question.
I have to agree with you, though, about anti-Semitism. It's clearly the gospel, and a passion narrative that is obviously fictional, but is pointedly designed to blame the Jews. I mean, Matthew has the crowd taking the blame for Jesus's execution, when crucifixion would point to the Romans as the culprits.
Besides that, well, anyway, I don't know about Jesus as an historical character, so I can't judge.
Right.
So I only deal with the James Paul material, where I actually have authentic historical material. So I can't judge about what this picture that was developed in the gospel literature is based on. But one thing, like you said, it's very pro-Roman, in the sense that the Jews are blamed for everything and not the Romans. The Romans want to save Paul. And Paul pulls out his Roman citizenship whenever he can. And he said, do you arrest Roman citizens? And they take him off to Caesarea under Roman guard. And they save him from the Jews who want to kill him.
Right.
You know, these
In
are
fact,
pretty
Acts,
accurate.
however unhistorical it is, the Romans are constantly saving Paul,
Of course.
and it's apparently the Jewish crowds who are his enemies, his threat.
At least the zealot type Jewish crowds and the Pharisee collaborations. People don't realize that the Jews are several parties, and the Pharisees, that I don't want to hurt Jewish feelings, who turned into rabbinic Judaism, as it were, over time, not at that time so much, they really were willing to, cooperate with the Roman authorities. They certainly weren't willing to fight, and they certainly weren't willing to commit suicide on Masada. In fact, most Jews are so shocked. They go to Masada and Jews, extremists, have committed suicide. Well, here's the point. Josephus has one picture, but Hippolytus, the early church father, you see, has 4 groups of Essenes. And that's what people don't realize. And the final 2 were Zealot Essenes and Sicarii Essenes. And who are the Sicarii Essenes? The Sicarii Essenes kill any enemies of the Jewish people without hesitation because of the Roman dagger they carried in their vests called a sika. And it was given the name of a Roman short sword. And so the Sicarii Essenes are the extremist Essenes, and these are the people we have at Qumran. And we have their literature, and I don't like to use them. I call this the literature of the Messianic movement in Palestine.
Right.
It's the very opposite of early Christianity.
Right. We even have an important fragment at Masada, at least one, right?
Sure, we have some Dead Sea Scrolls fragments.
So
absolutely.
My next question.
The scroll people. Yeah.
My next question
yeah.
Relates to the Clementine Recognitons, which I noticed that you brought that up several times in your books.
Sure.
In it,
not all Clementines.
In it, Paul is said to have been the one that killed James, and the way it narrates it is similar to the way it talks about in Acts regarding the stoning of Stephen. Paul and his group threw stones at James, and they did not retaliate. It says something like that.
Right? Passage so clearly as you do, so I can't really comment on it. As I said, my mind isn't. I'm 85 now, so I'm not as good as I was when I was 65.
All right.
Still functioning. My wife said, "Don't do this interview. You're not functioning." Well, I'm functioning enough to give general outlines.
Well, you seem to be functioning quite well.
Thanks.
And I do appreciate you being here for this interview.
Anyway, why don't you describe that particular the way the you see, I'm not into the other pseudo-Clementine materials because the Recognitions, the first book, is very historically grounded, and you can rely on some of the material, and it's also very zealot-minded. So, what's the actual passage where you find Paul responsible for the death of James? That's hard for me to get my mind around.
I don't precisely remember where it says it in there. I just remember Paul was at least involved in the stoning of James. It says something like that in Recognitions.
Yeah, well, he would like that to happen for sure.
Right.
He had linked to the Pharisee establishment, so that certainly has a lot of possible truth underlying it.
And my next question
have that kind of notice there. We don't have it in Josephus right now.
And my next question relating to that has to do with Acts, the parallel sequence again to Saul showing up after the death of James and Josephus as he does in Acts. Does this, in your opinion, highlight some kind of working relationship between Ananus, Ben Ananus, and Saul the Herodian? Ananus who killed James, according to Josephus? Or what? Because I do remember you saying that one of these Ananuses was Ananias of Damascus, or Ananias of Damascus in Acts.
You're getting too precise for me again. You're much closer to this material than I am, and you seem to have a better hold on it at the moment than I do. But Ananus, I don't think Ananus and Ananias, as I recall, are necessarily the same people. But Ananus is the high priest, or one of the high priest group. And these people are very much in league with the Pharisees and very much in league with the Romans. In fact, the Roman governors appointed them for a long time. And I don't know, particularly in this period. So I don't know what the relationship of Ananias and Paul might have been, but I'm sure it would have been cozy.
Right.
And
So,
someone like Paul would have been very happy to give someone like Ananias and the rest of the Jewish collaborating establishment, the data they needed to deal with someone like James and ultimately the other Dead Sea Scroll partisans.
Is it from Galatians 1:20, in which Paul states, "I am not a liar"? Was that the first verse? Was that the first thing that got you? Was that the what I'm curious about is that the first thing that made you think that he was the liar, the spreader of lies from the scrolls?
No, it had nothing. It just happened to be more collaborating information to put on the weight scale in favor of it. So I already knew that he was the liar in the scrolls, and that he had been expelled from the Dead Sea Scroll community because he knows the scrolls well. He uses a lot of scroll language in his authentic letters. You've got to be careful of the Pauline type letters and the letters like Galatians and the few others that people have identified. I think 1 Corinthians and a few of the others that have been identified as fairly authentic. So if you stick to the language there and then look at the scrolls, you see this guy has been among the scroll participants and has been expelled.
This is one of the most powerful elements of your work, is to show the ideological and linguistic way in which the author of the original Pauline corpus is keying off the very ideas and language of the sectarian documents of the scrolls. The cup of God's wrath, the very metaphors that he's using, some of them have their actual origins in scroll language.
Sure.
But in every case, Paul seems to be turning it on its head,
reversing them.
Ideologically opposing point.
But this Paul is an extremely frightening person. He is not a kind person, as I said. He's not a good person. He's very jealous. He's very after power. He gets power over the whole human race in the Western world, as it turns out. But I would prefer that Christians would go back to righteousness and follow the original leader of early Christianity in Palestine, James the Just, whether he was the brother of Jesus in the sense that they knew Jesus so well then. I'm sure whoever this Jesus was that finally gets into the literature was his brother. But whether they knew a lot about his brother at that point, I can't say. But you see, his brother is given the execution of a zealot. He dies the death of a zealot, and there's no around that. The Romans didn't make mistakes. They didn't crucify people who weren't dangerous to the established order. And this man, James is given a Jewish execution, stoning for blasphemy. That's in a Jewish establishment one. So why did the Jews do that? Because these groups that James was part of were not recognized by the Herodian Pharisaic establishment.
There would be no reason for the Sanhedrin to have been involved in a crucifixion, right? And they could have executed Jesus by stoning had he actually offended them and Mosaic law.
But this picture of Jesus executed on a cross is very convenient one. People love it. They love the cross and so on. They feel their heart goes out to them, etc. It's a very, I wouldn't want to say literary way of getting huge emotion centered around him, and has worked. But whether it's totally historical, I can't comment. There were so many people crucified at this time. This is
thousands of people were a forest.
Extremely representative. The Romans were totally unfeeling, very vicious, and would do anything to preserve and keep their power. And they demonstrated it through crucifixions.
Right. The ruthless good old days. Yes. Do you think?
I don't know who to compare.
Do you think that the term teacher of righteousness could be a leadership title for the Dead Sea Scrolls community that stretches back, to the founding of the community, perhaps more than a century earlier?
Oh, I'm sure. And I don't know exactly when it was found in the form we have it. You see, I mean, we get the picture that it seems to descend from the Maccabean movements of some kind.
Right.
But when a righteous one developed, or a righteous teacher as such, it's hard to put your finger on that. There are several Sadiqs who are mentioned in Josephus in the 1st century BC, as I recall. So
well, John the Baptist, Judas the Galilean, the so-called founder of the 4th philosophy, the starter of the Zealot movement, is supposed to have had a partner named Zadok.
Yeah,
Zadok. In itself, he had a partner who was a righteous one, perhaps.
And John the Baptist is certainly, even the presentation in Josephus,
right.
You see it's more historical than most things you get relating to this material. And the New Testament scripture pulls that out of Josephus to present the death of John the Baptist. So John the Baptist is a Dead Sea Scroll type character. He's even put to death right there across the Jordan River, right where the scrolls people were hanging out. So John is so authentic and so much part of this movement. And look, John the Bather, what do we have as the essence of the Qumran community? Bathing. And why were they bathing? I'll tell you one final thing, which turned me on totally. That is in the War Scroll. That these people are really preparing for a final apocalyptic war against not only all evil, but the Romans. Now, how can this little group of nobodies expect to take on the Roman army? The point is they expect to have the help of the heavenly host. I mean, they're very original and very, very impressively. I mean, it's very touching what they believe. We all know it's probably pure imaginary, but they believe it. And you have to give them credit. They believed it to the point they were willing to kill, die. And they felt that the heavenly host, they had several camps, not just around the Dead Sea, but extending all into northern Syria, etc. Islam ultimately comes out of some of these camps in the Syrian area that go down in the Arabian Peninsula to flee and so on. And Muhammad ultimately has contact with them, which is why Islam is closer to the Dead Sea Scrolls than early Christianity, because he knows these early groups. But anyway, because he's aggressive, he's militant, and so on. But the point is that they feel that the heavenly host are going to come down into their camps, join their camps. But here's their crazy, impressive, touching idea. The heavenly host cannot, the heavenly angels cannot abide human impurity. So if they come in contact with any human impurity as part of this holy war that they're going to fight against all evil on the earth, they won't go back up to heaven. They won't be able to go back up to heaven at the end. Their heavenliness or whatever is compromised. So this is their imaginative view. The camps had to be utterly pure, and that's why the scrolls have no women in the camps, no sex in the camps, no this and that, and so on. So all of what Paul says that in his literature, all the food in the butcher shops is clean and all this sort of, that's not the early movement. That's the very opposite. That's a Romanized opposite. So Paul, to me, is a very, I hate to put it that way, is a very evil demon, and he has hypnotized the world as we know it. And they're well-meaning. The people who've been they're well-meaning people. I'm not putting them down, but they have to realize they're following literature. They're not following history.
But in effect, he was an agent provocateur who, on behalf of Roman and establishment interests, infiltrated the Zealot movement.
I think so. You're right.
In order to find out information, uncover who the leaders were, maybe undermine their ideology.
And undermine it and reverse it into something he could capitalize on. And he did, successfully. He survived, and they died. And we don't have anything, and we're so lucky to have had this literature suddenly appear in the 20th century. That's a miracle. And yet then our scholarly crowd goes along and misinterprets the literature. Why? Because they don't read it. They don't read it. They read Josephus. Oh, this is a pacifist group, in the wilderness. And yeah, that's Essene Group 1. But that's Essene Group. That's not Essene.
Ignoring Josephus' own political motives in wanting to redescribe Jewish groups. I mean,
everybody who wants to know what Essenes were has to read Hippolytus. Hippolytus, right. The early church theologian, historian, as crazy as it may seem, gives us the accurate picture of what the Essenes were in Palestine.
There were militant groups on the Essenes.
There were 4 different groups, and the groups we're dealing with by the Dead Sea.
Well, even Josephus lets the mask slip a little sometimes when he says they couldn't be tortured to call another man Lord. And so why were Essenes being tortured if they weren't part of the rebellion? And Josephus appears to want...
Right. He does let the mask slip. You could torture Josephus and Paul, and they would certainly call another man Lord under torture.
Yes, whatever was required under torture. Right. Put all the blame for the war on fourth philosophy, this crazy innovation that Judas the Galilean and Zadok started, as opposed to any of the mainline groups.
Yeah.
So he's got his own political motivations here when he compares the Pharisees in one book or the Essenes in the other book to Stoics or Greek philosophers. And
yeah.
Right,
so this information, it's not even possible to get your mind around. It's like trying to get your mind around one of these balloon ships out in space. But if you tell this to people, except someone like yourself who is, actually, responded and had your whole outlook influenced by it, if you tell it to most people, they just run away. They don't want to hear it. And even scholars, I mean, you think I'm welcome among scholars? I think I'm basically persona non grata. They certainly don't.
Remarkable to me, because when I was taught history, I was told to put everything into its historical context. This means both cultural, political, and one of the things that's sort of distressing to me is how that is not done with early Christian literature. When you plug it into the political context of the time, your thesis becomes almost self-evident. It's been under the entire time. It is a critical reaction to stuff like the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarian documents. And in fact, the entire Jewish rebellion.
You could give this talk better than me, you see. Your mind. You don't even need
I doubt it, sir. I doubt it. You've forgotten more than I will ever know.
Yeah, but it's all on my books, fortunately, if anyone bothers to look.
Yeah, so, for which we must all be grateful. Those are amazing books. Yeah.
I mean, I did this book with Michael Weiss to begin with, and yet he's gone off into some other space orbit. But, I parted with him gratefully and never had another word with him after that was published. But it started the thing going of my ability to publish. And I had some really nice early books. I don't know, I can't get my hands on them, but I got some early Brill books, Maccabees, Zadokites, and Christians, James the Just and the Habakkuk Pesher. These were early things in the 80s that I did. And then I built on that for the big books that I did, James, the brother of Jesus, and the New Testament Code.
Do you think
masterpieces?
Do you think that some of the ideology in the New Testament, some of the Pauline ideology that we read in the New Testament, has its roots in, say, the court of Adiabene, where there were kings that were converted to Judaism, according to Josephus, and Josephus even describes some of the ideas being taught there. There was a rabbi, Ananias, who taught against certain...
Look, you got this data better than me.
and apparently they were ideologies such as don't store your treasures here on earth, but store them up where they're imperishable in the kingdom of heaven, which would come in right into the words of Jesus in the New Testament.
That's in the Bereshith Rabbah.
Do you think that the ideology that was being developed there for, in effect, newly converted Jewish kings could have made its way through Paul into the New Testament?
Well, I can't judge that, but what was going on in Adiabene or Adiabene, whichever pronunciation you prefer to keep?
How you pronounce it, darn place.
I think, as people may not realize, it's a community in northern Syria, Iraq area.
Yeah, during our...
Go ahead.
Okay. During our first interview, I actually brought up a similar question. It had something to do with King Bazus of Adiabene. But this kind of gets into your Agabus. You link Agabus to Abugarus, the king of Edessa, that the famine relief had to do with
You know
that.
my work better than I know
So, so my setting that aside, my next question for you is: could you discuss further about your conflicts with the scholars when they got their hands on the scrolls and then eventually getting them publicized?
Well, they had achieved all before I entered the picture, which is why, I was, keen on the scrolls. The scrolls were quite popular, but it became clear to me almost because I was also teaching um, early Jewish history in Palestine at this time, that it became clear to me that these documents were being massively misinterpreted. And I think whether it was purposefully or it just was spiritually convenient or it just happened to agree with their attitude, since most of them had been totally Paulinized, Christianized, whatever, and they didn't want to believe that there could be a group of literature that was the total antithesis of this. So what they did was they Josephusized it from the pacifist Essenes, and it agreed with their Christian orientation, and they felt comfortable. But and the Jewish scholars, I don't even know, except for the one in Oxford, whatever his name was, I can't even remember. He was different, but most of them just fell into line. And so when I saw this, I started writing these books, and I became, the the agent provocateur par excellence.
We're fortunate to have in you, sir, the real hero who convinced the man most responsible for convincing the Huntington Library to release their photostatic copy of the Dead Sea Scrolls. You will be remembered as a hero, I hope, forever.
Well, look,
Never.
Finish up.
So
The point is that James Robinson was up in Claremont, and he was a normal, except he was into the Nag Hammadi material quite intensely. He didn't have any heretical views or anything like that. But I had invited him down to Cal State Long Beach because I was the chairman, and he was semi-retired at that point, and he liked having some extra money coming in, and to teach a course. So we became fairly friendly, and it was through that connection and others, including the one in the Huntington Library, that I managed to get these people, impressed upon them the importance of releasing all the scrolls, so that one group didn't have a monopoly on their interpretation, that everyone could approach the scrolls on their own and not through the few editions that these super scholars that we now know about were promoting. And this, as you say, was a fairly crucial, dam-breaking moment.
Indeed. We all owe you a debt of gratitude, sir.
Well, you owe the guy in the Huntington Library one, too. He died shortly after that. He was a sweet person. I can't remember his name. Look at my mind. What was his name?
Now you've got the card.
And I liked him immensely. He was a very sweet person. He really was lovely. So we were fortunate. He was willing to listen to me, some heretical nudnik, if you want to call it that, rather than the establishment. And he let them all out. And wow, that was very.
For what it's worth, sir, I'm convinced that when you convinced me that we are right, and I'm convinced that if there's a cutting edge future to this scholarship, that you've pointed the way, no doubt about it.
If you have any mind or reason, it's got to be that way. I mean, you can't read the documents and suddenly think you're reading Essene pacifist documents talking about a final apocalyptic war against all evil and the heavenly hosts joining their camps and their purity, not because they believed in morality as such, but because the heavenly host would be polluted. all this sort of thing. When you actually read these documents and understand what their mindset, which is hard for these establishment people to do, then there's no other way you can deal with it. I don't say I'm an original thinker. It's all there. It's all there, and you can't miss it. You can't miss it. And it's beautiful stuff. I consider it as a nationalist Jew and a Zionist Jew, and I am that, and I have no embarrassment. I consider it beautiful literature. I know a lot of people would think of it as, oh, this is negative, ugly, brutal, violent. I consider it beautiful, and what we need. Unfortunately, the Jewish people on the whole have fallen in line with the establishment scholars. I don't even get many Jewish establishment scholars at the Hebrew University or other places following to any extent the ideas that I've set forth.
That's too bad.
But that's the way it is. That's the way life is. I don't mind. But you're very kind in what you said about me, and that's very, very
You'll always be a hero
pleasing.
To me. Truly. A hero of the mind.
Anything else we need to touch on here?
I think the final question that I have for you is, you brought up Epaphroditus a bit in your books. What led you to conclude that the Epaphroditus from Josephus is the same one mentioned in Philippians, the Epistle to the Philippians by Paul?
It just seemed logical. There's no way you can actually, what led me to conclude that. How many people by that type of name are running about or involved in these kinds of things. So these people begin to coalesce into single people, not multiples. That's all. It wasn't anything specific that put me onto it.
There were a couple of specifics though that you made in that very regard that got me over the line.
It was the Caesar's household thing in Romans. Well,
in that same letter to the Philippians, Paul talks about greetings from Caesar's household. I've gained access. Everyone in the Praetorian Guard has heard the message. If this fellow has such access to the Praetorian Guard and knows people in Caesar's household, we happen to have an Epaphroditus who was a major figure of Caesar's household from the 60s to the 90s.
Well, that's it. They begin to coalesce into single. I said they're single people, man. There weren't that many Epaphroditus running around, so you begin to get the connections. Yes, absolutely.
Right. So if we have an Epaphroditus who is connected to the Praetorian Guard and Caesar's household, it seems passing likely that it's the same Epaphroditus who served emperors from Nero to Domitian.
Yeah, well, you got that right better than me, even. Got to write all this in your next book.
Yes, sir.
I don't have energy for a next book. All I want to do is collect my old essays and put them into a final book. And I have a book of creative work that I started in college when I was 22 years old, which was 60 some odd years ago.
Back when you were still hanging out with those famous, right?
Right. All those people up there, right. I wasn't hanging out with them. I didn't like them.
Really?
They didn't like me either. I always have people who are known who don't like me, if they even know I exist. But no, I didn't hang out with them. What was his name? I can't remember his name. The poet guy. What was his name?
Ginsberg?
No, he went around with Ginsberg. What was his name?
Right.
Yeah, and then there was Kirk Sale, who was the son of a professor, and he was the editor of a paper. And there was this poet guy, but my brain has been dying, and he was well known. But none of these people gave one nod in my direction, even though I was even in those days writing literature and poetry, and I published all my poetry. So I have that out in a paperback, all my poetry from then and until I stopped writing it. Once I got into the academic type things, I stopped writing poetry. But I didn't stop writing prophecy. I went into prophecy. I put some prophetical works at the end of that poetry collection, which are kind of interesting, I think, although I haven't read them for a while. But they won't please anyone because they're very nationalistic. You have to realize that my great-grandfather, and I've told a lot of people this, and I'm sure I've told you guys, walked to Jerusalem from eastern Poland, Russia, Belarus area in the 1890s, the end of the 19th century. And he got as far as Istanbul with 4 sons. 2 then split and went the rest of the way to Palestine with him. And the other 2 thought they'd do better to take a boat to America and New York. And that's how come my people come from that area. But it turns out when I first went to Jerusalem back in 1950, 60, that area, I found my whole family there. And the weird thing, I was on my way there and I met my folks in Europe at a conference they were at. And I said, oh, since you're going to Jerusalem, I was going to go anyway, well, you have family there. And they never told me when I was young, one minute, that I have a whole family called Eisenman in Israel, who have since changed their name to Eitan. Eisen meaning iron, Eitan meaning strong. So they're all called Eitan, but they were called Eisenman at that time. And sure enough, I met them all, and I stayed in their house, and it was mind-boggling for me because I was 22 years old. Yeah, my whole family that had never been told to me before. So that was so I had a whole family there, and that kind of thing. So I forget what I was talking about before I got off on the family matter. But anyway,
that was the source. So, would you say that was the source for your interest in Middle Eastern culture and languages?
I had already been reading the Bible when I was hanging out in Paris with all the hippies and everybody. I wasn't with the hippies. I didn't get on with them, but I stayed at this place called the Beat Hotel. I think the guy's name we're talking about is Corso, no? Gregory Corso. Anyway, they stayed at the Beat Hotel. Ginsburg wasn't around anymore, but I was at the Beat Hotel, but I wasn't beat. I loved the Beat Hotel because they were poor, but I had some money coming in from my well-to-do parents, so I could get a nice room on the first floor all to myself, where they all shared rooms up in the attic.
Yeah, you definitely didn't qualify as a beatnik. You had your own place.
I had nothing to do with those guys. And they were there, but they, I was not a beatnik, and people call that. No, I was already, as I said, that's what got me into this. At college, I was already reading massively all literature that I could get, and I was already writing. So I didn't need their help to begin to be a poet and a writer, except I stopped when I got into this other research. But I published. I'm going to publish now all of this novel that I began there, and it's about 1,500 pages, and I've never put the final edition out, and I'm going to now. That's what I'm getting to next before I commit suicide or kick the bucket, rather. I'm going to touch wood. I don't want to spook. I'm going to finish. I'm going to not finish it. It's finished. I'm going to form it and get it out there, and it'll be this. It's James Joyce type of a novel, but it's Joyce's stuff is autobiographical, and this is autobiographical.
Oh, I see.
Putting that out. It's all done in the third person. No I stuff. I never believed in writing fiction with I. I always wrote it third person. He. I followed Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a young man.
Right. Got it. Wow. Fascinating.
Not going to be like Ulysses. It's going to be like Portrait of the Artist. I'm not into playing games or verbal gymnastics. I'm only into the story of how this happened, and that's all there. It'll treat college, it'll treat going up to Europe, it'll treat coming into Israel, meeting the family for the first time, going all the way to India, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I was always on my way to India. That's something I had nothing to do with those guys. And when I got to India, when I finally got there overland, there was a job waiting for me at the American School of New Delhi. And that's what I was looking forward to do, teach at the American School in New Delhi. And they offered me the job, and the next day I refused it. Why? I turned it down and left because my father had written me, please come home, son, I need your help in the business. And I didn't have the cojones to turn him down. But if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't have met my wife and all other things. et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's always an if then sort of thing. But that's what brought me back to America and got me into all this sort of crazy.
Well, thank you for joining us today. I mean, my gosh.
Yes.
Well, it's kind of you to be interested enough to listen to my discourses.
I love that.
Anyway,
You're an
I've
inspiration.
covered enough material for you that it's worth your while.
Thank you.
I do love your books.
Well, I told my wife, I never read my own books. So you guys are fortunate. You know what I'm saying. I don't read.
Well, someone should.
Well, I don't want to because I don't want to find things that I don't like. I want them to be the way they are, and I don't want to be influenced. I don't want to change anything. I just want to leave them the way they are. So if I read them, I might start getting worked up. Anyway, good to talk to you guys too, and thanks for your patience.
Thank you.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Thank you for joining us,
Good to
Professor
see you.
Eisenman.
Right. Good to see you.
Yep.
Shabbat shalom.